The call came at 2:17 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in March. I was standing in the hallway outside the conference room at Meridian Financial, still holding a pen I'd forgotten to put down after the budget review, and when I looked at the screen and saw it was my attorney, Janet Cho, calling me in the middle of a workday, I knew. Not the details. I didn't know the details yet. But something in the marrow of me knew that the thing I had been quietly, carefully preparing for had already begun. I picked up. She said 4 words before I could speak. They filed this morning. I walked into the nearest empty office, closed the door, and stood with my back against it while Janet told me what Richard and Sylvia Hargrove had done. My in-laws. My husband's parents. The 2 people who had spent 6 years making it clear that I was a guest in their son's life, had walked into Fulton County Family Court that morning and filed for emergency temporary guardianship of my children. Mila, who was 6. And Cooper, who had just turned 4 2 weeks ago and still slept with the same stuffed elephant he'd had since the hospital. My children. And while I had been sitting in a conference room talking about quarterly projections, they had been trying to take them. If you're watching this, please subscribe and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you, and you're going to want to stay for every word of this one. I need to take you back, because none of what happened that Tuesday makes sense without understanding the 6 years that came before it. I met Daniel Hargrove at 29. I was 2 years into a position as a financial analyst at Meridian, paying off the last of my student loans, living in a 1-bedroom apartment with a second-hand couch and a very reliable coffee maker. I was not unhappy. I was building something. Quietly, deliberately, the way I did everything. Daniel was charming in that effortless way that some people are born into, the kind of charm that comes from never having been told no in any way that stuck. He was handsome and funny and generous with compliments, and when he looked at me across a dinner table on our 3rd date and said you're the most grounded person I've ever met, I believed him. I believed he meant it as the highest possible praise. It took me years to understand that grounded was how his family described people who didn't have money. Richard Hargrove had built Hargrove Property Group from a single strip mall his father left him into a mid-sized commercial real estate company worth somewhere north of $40 million, depending on the quarter. He was the kind of man who wore his wealth the way some people wear cologne. You noticed it before he said a word. Sylvia Hargrove had never worked a paying job in her adult life, which she would tell you with a serenity that suggested she considered it a form of achievement. She volunteered on 3 charity boards, coordinated the family's calendar with the precision of a military operation, and had opinions about everything, delivered in a voice so measured and pleasant that it took you the first 6 months to realize she was insulting you. I met them on a Sunday dinner in October. Daniel's family home was a 6-bedroom colonial in Whitmore Hills with a circular driveway and a housekeeper named Patrice who had clearly been instructed to be invisible. Sylvia hugged me at the door with the warmth of someone completing an item on a checklist. Richard shook my hand and said, "Daniel tells us you're in finance." I said yes. He nodded the way people nod when they're already thinking about something else. Dinner was beautiful. The food was catered, which Sylvia mentioned twice, and the conversation moved like a river with a strong current. It carried you exactly where it wanted you to go, and it was very difficult to swim sideways. Daniel's younger brother, Carter, was there with his wife, Blythe, who had gone to the right college, summered in the right places, and laughed at Richard's jokes at exactly the right volume. I watched the whole thing like a person watching a performance they don't entirely understand but can tell is very expensive. On the drive home, Daniel said, "My parents loved you." I didn't say what I was thinking. I said something warm and easy and let the night close around it. But I had noticed things. The way Sylvia touched my hand when she asked where I grew up, as if confirming a suspicion. The way Richard asked about my family a second time after I answered the first time, like the answer hadn't quite registered in the category he was trying to place me in. The way Blythe had watched me from across the table with the particular alertness of a woman who understood exactly what I was walking into and had already decided I was not her competition. I married Daniel 18 months later in a ceremony that Sylvia planned with my input the way a general accepts suggestions from civilians. The flowers were her choice. The venue was a country club her family had belonged to since before Daniel was born. The guest list had 47 people on it that I had never met and would not see again. My side of the aisle had my mother, my two closest friends from college, and my coworker Janet, who had just started her own family law practice and who I invited because I liked her and because she made me feel like myself in a room that did not feel like mine. I remember Janet leaning over during the reception and saying quietly, "This is a lot of Hargroves." I laughed. She wasn't wrong. The first year of marriage was the way first years often are. You are both performing the best version of yourselves and the scenes don't show yet. Daniel and I bought a house 30 minutes from his parents in a neighborhood that Sylvia had identified as appropriate, which meant it was close enough for Sunday dinners and holiday appearances but not so close that I could pretend we were equals on the same block. I was still at Meridian. I had gotten a promotion 6 months before the wedding and was managing a portfolio analysis team. I liked the work. I was good at it. Daniel worked in his father's company, a title that shifted depending on the year but that always landed somewhere between director and undefined. His salary came from Richard. The amount was something I did not know for 2 years into our marriage because whenever I asked, Daniel's answer was always some version of "It's complicated" or "We should sit down and go through all of that together," and then the sitting down never happened. Mila was born 14 months after the wedding. Cooper came 26 months after Mila. And with the children came the Hargroves in a way I had not fully anticipated. Sylvia arrived at the hospital 17 minutes after I delivered Mila and stayed for 4 hours. She held the baby with the confidence of someone who had been waiting for this moment the way you wait for a plane that is finally boarding. She called Mila her girl. Not your girl. Her girl. I was lying in a hospital bed with a blood pressure cuff on my arm and I registered it and filed it away in that part of my mind where I kept the things I noticed but did not yet know what to do with. By the time Cooper was born, the pattern was visible. Sylvia came 3 times a week. She would arrive with food and opinions in equal measure, both unsolicited. She rearranged my pantry once and when I asked her to put it back she looked at me with something so close to pity that I had to walk to the other room. She enrolled Mila in a music class without asking me, then mentioned it to Daniel as a gift, and Daniel smiled and said, "That's so thoughtful, Mom." He always did that. He always took the version of events that required the least conflict and lived inside it. I used to think this was a flaw he was working on. Later I understood it was a feature, not a bug. It was the foundation of everything the Hargroves had ever built together. Richard was quieter about it than Sylvia but no less deliberate. He would ask me at dinners about my job in a way that barely concealed the subtext, which was, "Why are you still working when our son earns enough?" He said it once outright, the Christmas that Mila turned 2. He said it pleasantly, over dessert, with the same tone he used to discuss real estate markets. "Wouldn't it be better for the children if you were home full-time?" Daniel said nothing. I said I love my work. Richard said of course you do, and moved on to another topic with the practiced ease of a man who has always had the room. Sylvia touched my hand across the table. "It's just that we worry about the children," she said. "We want what's best for them." The "we" was deliberate. It was not Daniel and I or you and Daniel. It was we, meaning Sylvia and Richard, the Hargroves, the unit of authority that preceded our marriage and had every intention of outlasting it. I want to be precise about what happened over the next 3 years because precision matters when you are describing how something breaks, and this was a slow break, the kind that happens when pressure is applied not in a single moment but in 100 small ones that each seem unremarkable on their own. Sylvia began calling Daniel directly about the children's schedules rather than me. She would arrange pickups from preschool without checking with me first and then be confused when I said something about it, as if the coordination was simply obvious and I was the one making it complicated. She started a tradition of Saturday lunches at the Hargrove house that expanded, month by month, into Saturday mornings and Saturday afternoons and eventually full Saturday to Sunday overnights for Mila and Cooper, with or without Daniel and I present. She framed it always as giving you 2 time together, which might have been generous if I had asked for it, which I had not. The school conversation happened in September of the year Cooper turned 3. Sylvia brought it up at Sunday dinner, as she brought up most significant things, in public, at the table, surrounded by people who would function as witnesses to my response. She said she had spoken to the admissions director at Whitmore Academy, which was the private school Daniel and Carter had attended, and that Mila was at the top of the wait list. She said it the way you announce good news. She did not look at me when she said it. She looked at Daniel. And Daniel nodded slowly, the way he always nodded when his mother had already made a decision that was dressed up as a suggestion. I said Mila's already enrolled at Riverside Elementary. It's a great school and we're happy with it. Sylvia smiled at me. Of course, she said. We just want to make sure the children have every opportunity. She said children the way Richard had said children at Christmas 3 years earlier. Like they were a category she was responsible for. Not my children. The children. That night, after dinner, in the car on the way home, I told Daniel I needed him to speak to his mother about making decisions without consulting me. He said she means well. I said meaning well and doing well are two different things. He said you're so hard on her. I turned to look at him at a red light and asked him when, exactly, he had last made a parenting decision without his mother's input. He didn't answer. The light changed. We drove the rest of the way home without speaking and went to bed on our separate sides, and in the morning everything was smooth and pleasant on the surface again the way it always was, because Daniel could not live in tension and I had not yet decided what I was willing to do about that. I made an appointment with Janet Cho in January. Not because anything had happened yet. Because I had been keeping a list for 2 years and the list had started to feel like evidence. I brought it with me. 31 months of documented incidents. Unauthorized school enrollment conversations. Scheduled changes made without my consent. Remarks at family dinners that were recorded in my phone's notes app within an hour of when they were said. Mila telling me Grandma Sylvia says you have a very hard job, which is code, I told Janet, for Grandma Sylvia is building a case. Janet read through everything at her desk without speaking. Then she looked up and said, Nora, this is not nothing. I know, I said. What do I do? She said, first we make sure your name is exactly where it needs to be on every document that matters. Then we wait and see what they do next. What they did next was file for emergency temporary guardianship of Mila and Cooper on a Tuesday morning in March while I was at work. The petition was 14 pages. Janet had already obtained a copy by the time I reached her office an hour after the call. I sat across from her desk and read it, and my hands stayed very still because that is what I do under pressure. I go still. The petition alleged that I was emotionally volatile and financially irresponsible. It said that my work schedule created an unstable home environment for the children. It said that Daniel, my husband, had expressed concern about my fitness as a primary caregiver. That last part one read twice. Daniel had signed the petition. His name was on page 11 in blue ink next to a notary stamp dated 2 days earlier. 2 days earlier. While I had been sitting at the kitchen table helping Mila with a worksheet about rhyming words, my husband had been signing documents with his parents' attorney. Janet was watching me across the desk. I set the papers down. What do we do? I said. She opened a folder that I could see was already thick. We filed this morning, she said. 3 hours before they did. I stared at her. What? She said, I pulled your records last night. Something felt wrong. She slid a document across the desk. I recognized the format. A preemptive motion for sole legal custody and primary physical placement, filed at 9:14 that morning in Fulton County Family Court. Filed in my name. Filed before the Hargroves petition had been stamped and entered. She had moved first. By 3 hours and 42 minutes, Janet Cho had moved first. I looked at the document. Then I looked at Janet. She said, I told you in January. We wait and see what they do. Then we make sure you're already standing in the right place when they do it. I had a lawyer who planned 3 moves ahead in a family where no one had ever expected me to plan at all. And everything that came next began the moment I understood that I was not behind. I was already ahead. I drove home from Janet's office in a silence that had texture to it. Not the silence of shock. I had moved past shock somewhere between page 3 and page 11 of the guardianship petition. This was the silence of a woman reorganizing everything she thought she knew into the shape of what was actually true. The radio was off. The windows were up. I passed the grocery store where I bought Mila's favorite cereal every Sunday and the park where Cooper had learned to pump his legs on the swings last September, and I felt the ordinary world of my life sitting right next to the extraordinary rupture running through it, and I drove the 31 minutes home very carefully, both hands on the wheel, because I needed to be in control of something I could measure. Daniel's car was in the driveway. I had not expected that. He was supposed to be at the Hargrove offices until 6. I sat in my car for a moment before going inside. I thought about what Janet had said at the door of her office when I left. Let him talk first. Whatever he tells you, let him finish. Don't close a door you might need open later. She said it the way she said most things, quietly and without drama, and I had nodded and carried it with me the whole drive home, and now I was sitting in my own driveway, the driveway of the house where my children slept, and I needed every ounce of the steadiness I had spent 35 years building. Daniel was in the kitchen. He was standing at the counter with a glass of water he wasn't drinking, still in his coat, which meant he had arrived recently and had not yet figured out what to do with himself. When I walked in, he turned and his face did something complicated. Relief and guilt landing in the same expression. The specific look of a person who has done something they knew was wrong and has been waiting to be caught, with a mix of dread and something almost like gratitude that the waiting is over. I set my bag down on the chair by the door. I took off my coat. I hung it on the hook. I did all of this at my normal pace because I had decided in the car that I was not going to let this moment be his to control. He said, "Nora." I said, "I know about the petition." His jaw moved. He opened his mouth. I said, "Let me hear it from you." What followed was 22 minutes that I will carry for the rest of my life. Not because of what he said, which was a version of events I had mostly already assembled, but because of the pauses between the sentences, the places where he reached for words and found excuses instead. He said his parents had come to him in February. He said they were worried. He used that word, worried, the way the Hargroves always used it, as a container for control. He said there had been a conversation with their family attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had handled Hargrove legal matters for 20 years, and that the attorney had laid out options, and that one of the options was the guardianship petition, and that his parents had believed it was the right move, and that he had agreed. He said the last part looking somewhere to the left of my face. He said he thought I was stretched too thin. He said his mother felt the children needed more stability. He said it quietly, each sentence delivered like a man placing something fragile on a surface he isn't sure will hold. I let him finish. Then I said one thing. "You signed it 2 days ago." He nodded. "While I was helping Mila with her homework at that table," I said, pointing at the kitchen table 4 feet from where we were standing. He nodded again. His eyes were wet but not quite crying, which I recognized as the Hargrove version of genuine emotion, feeling it but not allowing it to arrive completely. I picked up my bag. I said, "I want you to stay at your parents' house tonight." He didn't argue. He didn't fight. He put his glass down, still full, still untouched, picked up his keys, and walked out the door. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after I heard his car leave. The refrigerator hummed. The clock above the stove read 4:48. In 40 minutes I needed to pick up my children from aftercare and make dinner and read a bedtime story and hold everything together in the space of those 2 small faces so that none of what was happening would land on them before I was ready to handle it. I did all of that. I made pasta with butter and Parmesan, which was Cooper's current favorite and Mila's second favorite, and I sat at the table with them and listened to Cooper explain at length why dinosaurs would beat sharks in a fight, and I laughed in the right places, and I braided Mila's hair while she brushed her teeth, and I read 2 chapters of her book and one of his, and I turned off the lights and stood in the hallway between their rooms in the dark for a moment before I went back to the kitchen, sat. Down at the table where 2 nights ago my husband had signed away our family, and opened my laptop. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. I spent the next 3 hours building a document. Everything Janet had asked for and everything I had kept on my own. 6 years of notes in a folder I had never shown anyone. Emails I had saved. Voicemails I had not deleted. A text exchange from October where Sylvia had told me directly that Mila had mentioned feeling lonely, which she had not mentioned to me, which meant Sylvia was having conversations with my 6-year-old daughter about her emotional state and then reporting them back as evidence. A voicemail from Richard in December asking Daniel, left on Daniel's phone which he had accidentally played on speaker while I was in the room, whether the Fitch appointment had been confirmed. December. They had been planning this since at least December. I had made my appointment with Janet in January and I had not even been fast enough. They had a 3-week head start and I had not known it. I compiled every piece into a single file and emailed it to Janet at 11:47 that night with the subject line everything. She replied at 6:12 the next morning with 2 words. Perfect. Send more. The children did not know their father was gone. I told Mila that Daddy was helping Grandpa with something and would be back soon, which was true enough to say without being a lie I would have to unmake later. Cooper accepted this with the flexibility of a 4-year-old who is more interested in whether his dinosaur figurines are in the right bin than in the domestic arrangements of the adults around him. I was grateful for that. I was grateful for a lot of small mercies in those first 2 weeks. The neighbor who waved at me in the driveway without asking questions. The coworker who covered a meeting I needed to leave early. The woman at Mila's school drop-off who had always been kind to me and who, on the 3rd morning after everything started, simply handed me a coffee and said you look like you could use this and did not require an explanation. The Hargroves were not quiet. That was something Janet had predicted. She said people who file emergency petitions and then lose the first move don't go quiet. They get louder. She was right. Sylvia called me 4 times in the first week. I let every call go to voicemail, not because I was hiding, but because Janet had been explicit. Do not have a single unrecorded conversation with them. Anything said in an unrecorded call can be paraphrased and reshaped and presented later as something it was not. Sylvia's voicemails were extraordinary documents. The first 2 were warm and reasonable, the voice of a grandmother who only wanted what was best, who was confused by the legal situation, who missed the children. The 3rd one shifted. She said she hoped I understood that this was not personal. She said the family had concerns that went back further than I knew. She said some things are better handled within the family, which is a sentence that had no legal standing whatsoever but was designed to make me feel that going to court was a betrayal of something sacred. The 4th voicemail was Richard. He said one sentence. Nora, let's resolve this like adults. He said it pleasantly. He said it like a man who had never once in his life resolved anything on terms that weren't his own. I forwarded all 4 voicemails to Janet before dinner. The family court mediator assigned to the case was a woman named Dr. Patricia Weller, and the first session was scheduled for 3 weeks after the petitions were filed. Both petitions, mine and the Hargroves, would be heard together, with mediation as the required first step. I had spoken to Janet about what to expect. She told me Dr. Weller was experienced and methodical and would not be impressed by wealth or family name. She said bring documentation. I said I have documentation. She said bring more. What I did not know, going into that first mediation session, was that Richard Hargrove had done something in the week before it. Something that Janet discovered on a Thursday morning when she called me at work with a voice that was carefully neutral in a way that told me the news was not. She said the Hargroves had pulled Mila's school records. Not from Riverside, where Mila attended, but from Whitmore Academy, the school Sylvia had tried to enroll her in the previous September. What the records showed was that in November, 4 months before the petition was filed, Sylvia Hargrove had submitted an application to Whitmore Academy on Mila's behalf. The application listed Sylvia Hargrove as Mila's legal guardian. not grandmother. Guardian. She had applied to a private school as her granddaughter's legal guardian in November. The petition wasn't filed until March. She had been documenting an alternate reality for 5 months. Building a paper trail in which she was already something she had no legal right to be. Janet paused on the phone and said, "Nora, this is the kind of thing that changes a case." I said, "What do we do with it?" She said, "We wait for exactly the right moment." The mediation session was held in a building downtown on a Thursday afternoon. The room was designed to feel neutral: beige walls, a round table, water glasses at every seat, the visual language of a space that was trying very hard not to take sides. I arrived 12 minutes early. I was wearing the navy blazer I wore to board presentations, not because I was performing, but because I had learned a long time ago that when someone is trying to make you look small, you show up as large as you actually are. Janet was already there. She had a folder 2 inches thick on the table in front of her and a legal pad and a pen she had not opened yet. She looked up when I walked in and gave me a small nod that meant we're ready. I sat down and poured myself water and waited. The Hargroves arrived 8 minutes later. Richard first, then Sylvia, then their attorney Gerald Fitch, who was older than I expected and moved through the room with the ease of a man who had won things in rooms like this before. Daniel came in last. He sat down on the other side of the table, across from me, and looked at the water glass in front of him. He did not look at me. Dr. Weller introduced herself, explained the process, and asked if everyone was ready to begin. Gerald Fitch said yes before she had finished the sentence. What followed was 2 hours that I will describe precisely because the details matter. Richard spoke first, with Gerald Fitch guiding him through a prepared statement about the children's welfare and the family's deep concern and the instability of the home environment. He used the word instability 4 times. He used the phrase our grandchildren 7 times. He did not use my name once. Sylvia spoke after him. She was softer, more maternal. She talked about the children's needs, about how much she loved them, about her experience as a mother and her dedication to the family. She cried at one point, just briefly, a single tear handled with a handkerchief she produced from her purse with the timing of someone who had rehearsed the moment. Daniel said almost nothing. When Dr. Weller asked him to speak to his concerns about the home environment, he gave a short, careful answer that sounded like something written for him, which I suspected it was. Then Dr. Weller looked at me. She said, "Ms. Ellis, would you like to respond?" And I said yes. I had 3 things I wanted to say and I had practiced them in the car on the way over and in my kitchen the night before and in the shower that morning. I said first that I had been the primary caregiver for both children since Mila's birth, and that I had documentation of every medical appointment, every school conference, every extracurricular enrollment in a file I was happy to provide. I said second that I had been employed continuously at Meridian Financial for 7 years with consistent performance reviews and a salary that fully covered the family's expenses, documentation also available. Then I paused and I looked at Janet, and Janet opened the folder in front of her and removed a single page, the Whitmore Academy application, and slid it across the table to Dr. Weller. I said the third thing. I said in November of last year, 4 months before this petition was filed, Sylvia Hargrove submitted an application to Whitmore Academy on my daughter's behalf listing herself as Mila's legal guardian. My daughter has 2 parents, both living, both competent. No court had granted guardianship to anyone. No one had given Sylvia Hargrove permission to represent herself as my child's guardian to a school institution. I said it without raising my voice. Without accusation in the tone, just the clean, flat presentation of a fact. The room went very still. Dr. Weller looked at the document. Then she looked at Sylvia. Sylvia's handkerchief was still in her lap. It had stopped moving. Richard's face had changed. Not much, just around the jaw, the tightening of a man who has just realized the board has been set differently than he thought. Gerald Fitch's pen was not moving. Janet's was. She was writing something on her legal pad in her small, precise handwriting and she did not look up. Daniel looked at the Whitmore document and then he looked at me for the first time since we had sat down, and in his eyes I saw something I had not expected to see there. Surprise. He had not known. His parents had been building this before they brought him in and he had not known the whole of it. I watched that understanding arrive in his face and I felt something complicated. Not quite pity. Something quieter than that. The recognition of a man who had been used differently than he thought he was being used, which did not excuse what he had signed, but which was a different thing than what I had feared. Dr. Weller set the document down. She said she would need to take a brief recess. She stood. She left the room. The silence she left behind was the loudest thing I had heard in years. Sylvia reached for her water glass and her hand was not quite steady. Richard looked at Gerald Fitch. Fitch was looking at the table. There was a conversation happening between those two men without a single word being spoken, and what it said was that the ground had just shifted and neither of them had been standing in the right place. I poured myself more water. My hand was perfectly still. I had 6 years of practice at being still in rooms where the Hargroves expected me to flinch. I was not going to flinch today. Not with my children's names on papers across the table. Not with everything I had built in those 3 hours after Daniel left, in those late-night emails to Janet, in 31 months of quiet, careful notes on my phone. The truth had always been there. I had simply spent 6 years making sure it was documented. And the room was only now beginning to understand what that meant. Dr. Weller was gone for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall above the door without looking like I was watching it, which is a skill I had developed over years of budget presentations where the numbers were bad and the room needed to believe I was calm. 11 minutes. In that time, Richard spoke quietly to Gerald Fitch in a register too low for me to hear. Sylvia sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the table. Daniel looked at the window. At one point he turned his head very slightly in my direction and then turned it back. I did not help him. I did not offer anything across that table. He had signed his name on page 11 and he was going to have to find his own way through what that meant. Janet wrote on her legal pad. I read upside down the way I had taught myself to in client meetings. She had written one word. Good. She underlined it twice. When Dr. Weller returned, she sat down, placed her hands flat on the table, and looked at the Whitmore Academy document for a moment before she spoke. She said she had some questions about the application and she directed them at Sylvia. Not at Gerald Fitch. Not at Richard. At Sylvia. She asked Sylvia to explain the circumstances under which she had submitted the application. Sylvia's answer was prepared, I could tell, because it came out too smooth. She said she had simply been making inquiries on the family's behalf. She said Daniel had asked her to look into schools. She said she may have used imprecise language on the form. Dr. Weller said the form had a field for relationship to applicant and that the word entered in that field was guardian, not grandmother. Sylvia said she hadn't filled the form out herself, that her assistant had handled the paperwork. Dr. Weller nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are not agreeing with you but are choosing not to say so yet. Then Dr. Weller looked at Daniel. She asked if he had authorized his mother to list her as Mila's guardian on any document. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Gerald Fitch moved slightly in his chair as if to speak. Daniel said no. One word. No. Not quietly, not loudly, just clearly, and I watched Richard's hand on the table go very still. Sylvia looked at her son for the first time since we had sat down. Whatever she had expected him to say in this room, that was not it. Daniel did not look back at her. He looked at Dr. Weller and he said I did not authorize that. I did not know that application existed until 30 seconds ago. There was a long pause. Then he looked at me. Across the table, across the petition, across 6 years of Sunday dinners and kitchen counter conversations and a signature on page 11 that he was only now beginning to understand the full weight of. He said, "I'm sorry, Nora." Dr. Weller let the moment sit before she moved on. Janet did not look up from her legal pad but I saw the pen pause. The mediation session ended without resolution, which Janet had told me was likely. "These things don't resolve in one room," she said afterward in the hallway while the Hargroves gathered their things inside. "They resolve over time, under pressure, when the other side does the math and realizes the math doesn't work in their favor." She said the Whitmore application had done something significant. It had demonstrated premeditation. It showed that the guardianship filing was not a worried family responding to a crisis. It was a plan. A coordinated plan that had been running for months before Daniel was brought in to sign, and that distinction was going to matter. She said Gerald Fitch was a good attorney, but he was working with a story that had just developed a very serious crack. I drove to pick up the children. Cooper ran at me from the aftercare room the way he always did, full speed, no brakes, arms out, face wide open with the complete trust of a 4-year-old who has never once had a reason to doubt that his mother would be standing there. I caught him. I held him for a moment longer than usual. Mila came behind him at her own pace, backpack on, a drawing she had made in art class held carefully in both hands. She showed it to me before she said hello. It was a picture of our house with 4 figures out front, 2 tall and 2 small, and above the house she had drawn the sun with rays coming off it in every direction. She had labeled each figure in her careful 6-year-old printing. Mommy. Daddy. Mila. Cooper. I looked at that drawing for a long time in the parking lot with the afternoon light coming down on both of them. Then I folded it gently and put it in my bag, right next to the folder with Janet's documents, and I drove my children home and made dinner and let the evening be what evenings are supposed to be for small people who do not know that the ground has been shaking under their feet. 3 weeks after the mediation session, Gerald Fitch contacted Janet with a proposal. The Hargroves were willing to withdraw the guardianship petition in exchange for a formal grandparents' visitation agreement, structured and documented, with defined terms. Janet called me and read it out. I listened to the whole thing. Then I asked one question. What happens to the Whitmore application in that scenario? She said it becomes a matter of record either way, since Dr. Weller had already documented it in her session notes. The withdrawal didn't erase it. It just meant it surfaced in a family law file rather than in open court. I said, "What do you recommend?" She said, "I recommend we counter." I said, "Counter with what?" She said, "Sole legal custody with a structured visitation schedule for the grandparents that you control, not the court, not the Hargroves. You define the access." She paused. "They filed an emergency petition claiming you were unfit. You now have documentation proving they were building a false paper identity for your daughter for months. That is not a family that gets to dictate terms." I said, "Send the counter." She sent it by end of business. The response from Gerald Fitch came in 6 days. They accepted. Every term. The grandparents' visitation schedule as I defined it. Sole legal custody in my name. Primary physical placement with me. Daniel would have standard parenting time, to be arranged separately in the divorce proceedings, which had begun as a parallel process 3 weeks after he left. The guardianship petition was formally withdrawn on a Tuesday morning, 47 days after it had been filed. Janet sent me a text when the withdrawal was confirmed. It said done. I was in a meeting at Meridian when the text came in. I looked at it under the conference table. Then I put my phone face down and finished the meeting because the work was still the work and I had always done both things at once. The divorce was quieter than the guardianship fight. Not painless, but quieter. Daniel had retained his own attorney, separate from the Hargroves' Gerald Fitch, which Janet said was a meaningful choice. It meant he was separating himself from his parents' legal strategy, at least formally. He did not contest the custody arrangement. He did not dispute the asset division. He showed up to the required sessions and he was civil and he kept his voice steady and he did not, in any of those meetings, try to minimize what had happened. I did not forgive him in those rooms. Forgiveness was not a thing that belonged in a courthouse conference room with attorneys present. But I registered what he was doing, the not fighting, the not deflecting, and I filed it away in the category of things that might matter later in a different kind of conversation. What he did not do was apologize to me directly again after the mediation session. Not in the divorce proceedings, not in the co-parenting coordination emails we began exchanging through a platform Janet recommended. He said the right logistical things. He was consistent with his parenting time. He showed up on time. He did not speak badly of me to the children, and I knew this because Mila would have told me, and Mila told me everything. But the words he had said across the table in that mediation room, "I'm sorry, Nora," those sat somewhere between us unfinished, not because they weren't said but because sorry is the beginning of something, not the end of it, and neither of us had gotten to the part that came after. That conversation happened 4 months later, in September, in a parking lot outside Mila's school after the fall open house. We walked out at the same time and stood beside my car for a moment with the September air cool between us, and he said, "Can I say something?" I said yes. He said I didn't know about the Whitmore application. I said I believe you. He said I should have known. He said the signs were there and I didn't look at them because looking at them would have required me to do something about them and I didn't want to. I said I know. He was quiet for a moment. There was a sound from the school gym, some music from the open house still going, someone's child laughing. He said I'm going to do better with them. He meant Mila and Cooper. I said I know you are, because the logistics had already shown me he was trying, and I was not going to withhold that acknowledgement. It cost me nothing and it was true. He nodded. We said goodnight. He got in his car. I got in mine. That was the most honest conversation we had in 6 years of marriage, and it happened in a parking lot on a Tuesday night after it was already over. I drove home and sat with that for a while. There is a specific sadness in understanding exactly when something could have been different and knowing that the window has closed. I allowed myself to feel it. Then I made tea and went to bed. The Hargroves took longer. Sylvia sent a card in July, 3 months after the withdrawal. Handwritten, 2 pages, her best stationery, the cream linen paper she used for thank you notes after dinner parties. She wrote that she loved the children and missed them and hoped we could find a path forward for their sake. She wrote that she was sorry for the pain the process had caused. She did not write that she was sorry for filing the petition. She did not write that she was sorry for the Whitmore application. She wrote around those things with the grace of a woman who had spent 71 years learning how to express remorse without admitting fault. I read the card twice. Then I put it in the drawer where I kept the structured visitation agreement. It could live next to the documentation. That felt like the right place. Richard never contacted me directly. I did not expect him to. Richard Hargrove was a man who had built everything he owned by never conceding the first position, and a personal apology to his daughter-in-law would have required him to concede not just the legal position but the premise that had underlain it. That he was the authority. That his opinion of me determined my standing. That the word instability, said 4 times in a mediation room, had the power to reshape what I had built. It did not. It never did. The word had not been true when he said it. He just hadn't known yet that I had the proof. The visitation schedule went into effect in August. The first Sunday, I drove Mila and Cooper to the Hargrove house at 2 in the afternoon, which was the time I had specified in the agreement. Sylvia opened the door. She looked at my children the way she had always looked at them, with a love that I had never doubted was real, even when everything else about her behavior was something I needed to stand against. The love was real. The methods were wrong. Those 2 things can both be true, and I had learned to hold both of them without letting either one erase the other. I said I'll be back at 6. Sylvia nodded. She said thank you, Nora. She said my name with a care she had not used before. Small, but I heard it. I got in my car. I sat in the driveway for a moment. Then I drove away and spent 4 hours doing exactly what I wanted with no negotiations required. What I did with those 4 hours, and with every set of free hours that followed as the new structure settled into rhythm, was work. Not because I had no other option, but because the work was mine in a way that nothing the Hargroves had ever tried to claim was mine. My portfolio at Meridian had grown during those 47 days in ways that surprised even me, because pressure, it turns out, had always been something I functioned well under. My manager noticed. He said in October that he was recommending me for a senior director position. I said I'd like that. He said, "You've always been the steadiest person in this building." I thought about what steady had cost me. I thought about what it had also built. I said thank you and meant it without any of the weight those words used to carry. I moved in December. Not far, 20 minutes from the school, same district, different house. 3 bedrooms, a yard with a maple tree that still had some leaves on it when we arrived, a kitchen with a window above the sink that caught the morning light in a way that made me stop the first time I saw it and just stand there for a moment. It was mine. Not ours. Not the house that had been selected in a neighborhood Sylvia identified as appropriate. Mine. I chose it because the school was good and the yard was big enough and the kitchen window faced east and I wanted to drink coffee in the morning in my own house with the light coming in from a direction I had chosen myself. Mila helped me unpack the kitchen. She was very serious about where things should go, which is a quality she has always had and which I love completely. Cooper unwrapped exactly 3 items before deciding the empty boxes were more interesting than the contents and spent an hour building a fort in the living room with packing material and a blanket. I sat on the floor with them in a half-unpacked kitchen and ate pizza out of the box and listened to Cooper explain the military strategy of his cardboard fort, and I felt something settle in my chest that I recognized as the specific relief of being in the right place after a long time in the wrong one. There are things I know now that I did not know 2 years ago. And I want to say them plainly because this is not a story about being smart or being lucky or having the right attorney, though Janet Cho is extraordinary, and if you ever need a family law attorney in this state, I want her name on your lips. This is a story about documentation. About the quiet, unglamorous discipline of writing things down and saving things and building a record not out of suspicion but out of self-respect. Because if you are in a family where your word is not believed, where your version of events is routinely reframed and smoothed over and made to seem smaller than it is, the only thing that cannot be reframed is a timestamp. The only thing that cannot be smoothed over is a signature on a form that lists a word that was never yours to give. I did not win because I was angrier or louder or more willing to fight. I won because I had been paying attention for 6 years and I had the receipts. I still have Mila's drawing. The one with the 4 figures and the sun and all the labels. It lives on the refrigerator in the new kitchen, right at Mila's eye level, where she can see it every morning. The figures she drew are still labeled Mommy, Daddy, Mila, Cooper, and sometimes I look at it and think about what she knew, at 6 years old, about who belonged in that picture. She never doubted it. Children rarely do. It's the adults around them who get confused about what family means and start filing paperwork to redefine it. Mila just picked up a marker and drew the truth as she understood it and taped it to her mother's refrigerator. I take my lessons where I find them. Daniel sees them every Wednesday evening and alternate weekends. He has been consistent, which I said I noticed and I am saying it again because it matters. He brought Cooper a new dinosaur figurine 2 weeks ago, a Spinosaurus, which Cooper immediately declared superior to all others and which has now been given a position of honor in the fort. He is trying. I can see it. Whether trying becomes something larger over time is not a question I can answer for him, and it is not mine to manage. I have my own work to do. I have a kitchen with a good window and 2 children who fall asleep easily and a career that is moving in a direction I chose. That is enough. That is more than enough. Sylvia asked me in November, at a handoff, if we could have coffee sometime. Just the 2 of us. She said she had things she wanted to say that she hadn't found the right words for yet. I said let me think about it. I have not said yes. I have not said no. I am holding that door at the width it is currently open and I am not yet certain which direction I will move it. What I know is that the decision is mine. The terms are mine. The timeline is mine. For the first time in 6 years, no one is filing paperwork to take those things from me. And if anyone ever tries again, they should know that Janet Cho's number is still in my phone and my notes app is still running. I have never stopped paying attention. I just don't have to do it from a defensive crouch anymore. I can do it from a house I chose, in a kitchen that faces east, with my name on the deed and the light coming in exactly the way I wanted it. My children are well. That is the only sentence that has ever really mattered. Everything else, the petition, the mediation room, the Whitmore application, the 11 minutes on a beige room clock, was the path between who I was when I first sat across a Sunday dinner table from the Hargroves and who I am right now. I would not choose to walk that path again. But I am not sorry for where it ended. I am standing exactly where I am supposed to be. And no one had to give me permission. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.